All right, everybody, it's time for our Grassroots Citizen panel. And joining me is strategic and political consultant T.J. O'Hara, TV and film producer Charles Belk, and columnist and liberal activist Jonathan Harris. Welcome, everybody. Jonathan, let me start with you. I got a feeling, I'm going to go out on a limb here and predict that you were unhappy with the Ferguson grand jury decision.
Well, what on earth would lead
I have
you
no
to
idea that makes me think that.
What on earth would make you think? Well, of course. I've always felt that rational people would think that someone being brutally murdered in the middle of the street and then left there for 4 hours after being shot at, I think, 11 times, somewhere around there, is outrageous. But, I mean, I guess this is kind of a new normal that we call the villain the victim and then the perpetrator of the crime. Like,
you don't feel that Darren Wilson had any justification whatsoever for shooting him?
Of course not. Now, now, I will say that if he had shot him in the car where the altercation took place, that would have been a different thing. If that was where he shot him, that would have been fine. But he waited until he evaded him, and he says it in his own testimony. He says, he evaded me, and I made the decision whether or not to let him go and call for backup and kind of follow afterwards, or shoot him, and that's exactly what he did. And that's idiotic, but very American, I might add.
TJ, I think our friend Jonathan is leaving out a few things.
Well, maybe just a few. You know, one of the things I think is interesting that I haven't heard discussed anywhere else is whether or not the prosecutor would have even brought the case before a grand jury in any other circumstance. I think there was almost politically driven to do it.
If all the parties involved had been the same race, had been all white or all black, we're not even having this discussion.
I don't even think it has anything to do with that. When you look at the physical evidence and the credible witnesses, I don't think it's a winnable case from a prosecutor's standpoint. So I think the prosecutor probably wouldn't have even brought it to a grand jury. I think what happened is there was so much public attention and media attention given to it, he felt compelled to bring it before a grand jury.
Charles, were you surprised by the results?
You know, I think that the way they rolled it out, that you could tell what the results were going to be. They gave you time to prep for it. I'm not surprised. It's unfortunate. I don't like the results myself. And not saying that I was there, I don't know what it should be, but I just wish that as opposed to being a grand jury, that there should have been a trial. When anyone gets killed, and from the evidence I saw, I think there should have been a little bit more of a process in place.
When I hear people say, I wish he had at least been indicted so we could have had a trial, my response is, I agree with TJ. This is a slam dunk, reasonable doubt case if I've ever seen one. So we have a trial, and then you have a trial like you did in Florida where the defendant is found not guilty, and then people still feel there's been a miscarriage of justice. TJ?
Well, Larry, I think that's really the key issue. What would have happened had there been an indictment, had the facts been played out the way they seemingly have? Because this was an unusual grand jury that had access to all sides as opposed to usually a singular side.
I've never seen a grand jury do that before.
So if a open trial would have come to the same conclusion, what would the response have been? Would people have just embraced that, or would we have seen protests again? And the problem is, I think, we've thrown out presumptions of innocence, and we've assigned presumptions of guilt, not only to the police officer, but to the victim. I think there's been an unfair characterization of people in cases like this, and we need to get past that and start looking at the facts and applying the law on an equal basis.
Jonathan, do you think Eric Holder was helpful when he went to Ferguson and said, not only that I'm here as AG, but I'm also here as a black man? If I'm Darren Wilson and I'm watching television and I see the AG come to my city where I'm about ready to be going down for allegedly murdering a black man, and I hear the AG say, I'm here not only as an AG, but I'm here as a black man, I'm going to feel that I'm not going to get fairness.
So there's this sort of like false equivocation that I think happens in the United States, which is a little silly. When it's convenient.
You want to be silly? You want to go outside? You want to go outside? You want to take it outside?
See what happens.
You want to take it outside?
And they say liberals. No. No, it's this sort of false equivocation where it's like, oh, everything's equal when it's convenient. The dynamic of blacks and whites in this country is dramatically different. So it's not necessary when you make up 70% of the population to go, I'm one of you. You're everywhere. There's no need for you to say you're one of me. But when you make up 12% of a population and you have the interaction with the justice system that black people have, not because of any wrongdoing of their own necessarily, but because it's been shown time and again. I mean, stop and frisk in New York was just ruled that it was using racist tactics. It was implemented using racist tactics, and they had to change it. I mean, that's the kind of interaction that certain communities have with the justice system. So yes, it was very appropriate for Eric Holder to go there and do that. And yes, he calmed tensions down. He absolutely did, and it was completely appropriate.
Charles, a lot of people feel part of the problem is that the police force in Ferguson doesn't look like the people of Ferguson. I live in L.A. We had a black police chief during the O.J. Simpson case. He conducted a thorough departmental review to find out whether anybody planted any evidence. Did anybody do anything wrong? He concluded that nobody did anything wrong. The community still didn't believe him. Still didn't believe the police. Still believed the police planted evidence.
Well, I think that in any situation, we react a little better to people that look like us. And in the situation in Ferguson, they had nobody that looks like them on that police force.
They had 3 people.
And I just think in general that situation is a problem. However, like you mentioned, when a wrong is done in someone's mind, it takes a lot to convince them otherwise, regardless of who's delivering that information.
Reverend Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, people like that, Jonathan, have said black people are under attack. After the acquittal in the Trayvon Martin case, Reverend Jackson said black people are under attack.
Right.
Really?
Well,
is that helpful? Tell me you don't feel that way, Jonathan.
It's kind of true, and I say that it's, well, and by kind of I mean it's absolutely true. When you look at, for example, 2 times a week in the United States, a white officer kills a black person. They are twice as likely, if they're under 21, to be killed than their white counterparts. Yes, they're under attack. It's a fact. It's not up for discussion.
Jonathan,
so
20 times
a
day a black person is killed by another black person. 20 times a day.
I'm glad that you brought that up.
In Chicago, a lot of these crimes are unsolved.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you brought that up. That's very important. 93% of black people who are killed by another black person.
Right.
What was that? Giuliani was so eloquently brought that up. He left out, though, that 84% of whites that are killed by someone are killed by other whites as well.
Why is that a talking point for so many people?
It's a talking point because you say it, and Republicans say it as if it's like, my God, if you're going to be killed by somebody, you should look out for. And it's like, well, when the numbers when there's less than a 10% difference.
The reason I say it is this: 7,000 black people were killed last year. Almost all of them by other black people.
Right.
You're talking about unarmed black men shot by cops. It might happen 300 times a year, one a day, as opposed to 20 times a day, and 7,000 black people killed every single year, almost always by other black people.
Okay, so but
now when a cop kills an unarmed black person, we want to march on Washington. But when a black person kills another black person, as happens in Chicago quite often, and the majority of those cases are unsolved, we don't do anything.
You know what's fascinating about that is it's very similar to when someone is killed by someone of the same race. All of a sudden, there's no need for like hate crimes legislation. Like, why would you need to? Because you're the same race. That doesn't make the crime any less abhorrent. It just means that there's certain factors that are no longer factored in. Yes, when you have been under attack from the United States government, like black people have been their entire time in this country, and you surely don't argue that point, I know. And while it is much less, of course, that has been the relationship of the black community with the United States government. It always has been. So when you've got a community like, I'm sure you're familiar with Black Wall Street, that was torched, terrorized by white America, not because of anything that they did, just because they didn't like it. They didn't like that it was a very affluent, well-built community, and they burned it to the ground. So yes, absolutely.
2014,
it's very much 2014
who has been reelected.
I forgot that the black president. I forgot.
We're going to take a quick break.
Racism ended that
More
day.
with our grassroots citizen panel after the break. Stay with me. You're watching Rick Amato Show right here on OAN. Okay, we're back. We're in the middle of a grassroots citizen panel. Let's talk about the burning and the rioting that's taken place in Ferguson before we turn to Grubergate. Yeah. Most of the businesses that have been burned, Charles, are black-owned.
Yeah, and that's a terrible thing. You saw it doing Rodney King. You see it doing whenever a verdict like this comes back. And it's a horrible thing that the community that you live in is getting burned down. My question, though, is that I'm not sure who exactly is doing that, who's starting that activity. Right. Because we've seen or we've heard reports that there's outsiders or someone else is coming in and starting that whole stuff.
Right, although I heard somebody say locally that's kind of an excuse that people are saying to divert attention from the fact that people in that community are behaving irresponsibly. Now, even if there are people coming in from the outside, TJ, burning down black-owned businesses, burning down businesses that are mom-and-pop businesses that people have started for years and years and years, what's the point? To whom are you targeting your anger?
Well, it's irrational because it's very difficult to call for justice by creating a crime. And that's what we see. It's almost become an expectation. When you have the governor coming out and saying, I'm getting the National Guard ready, when you have the president and the attorney general coming out and saying, try and be calm, there's an expectation for that type of behavior. And I think if we dialed that back a little bit, we could start impacting the behavior.
I think there's one other thing, too, that's going on in this country in general, in my opinion, in Ferguson and Missouri in particular. A few years ago, Claire McCaskill, the senator from Missouri, ran for the first time. One of the things she said in order to get votes from black people, she said George W. Bush let people die on rooftops during Hurricane Katrina because they were poor and because they were black. End of quote. I thought it was an extremely irresponsible statement, and Tim Russert, the former host of Meet the Press, jumped on her for it, and she basically backed down. But she said it over and over again to black people there. Now, if you're telling black people that they're under siege, that they're under attack, that the government basically tried to nail them because they're black, why shouldn't they distrust the police when the police say we did not shoot this person for no reason? Why shouldn't they distrust authorities when authorities are telling them something's happened? We've taught them that they're under siege. We've taught them that they're victims. Why shouldn't they behave that way?
You know, I'm sorry. Number one, the way that you're referring to the black community is after like this impressionable group of children. It's like you went and you told the class that was what. Just look around. I mean, they saw the bodies floating around. I mean, they didn't need someone to tell them that they were
floating around.
Or there were bodies in the street, floating in the street. There were people being left. It was a horrible mismanagement by the president and by several different departments. Now, why he did it is irrelevant. I don't really care, but to suggest that like they had to be told that as opposed to looking around and seeing it is ridiculous. And as it relates to the rioting, I mean, I'm sorry.
The point is, Jonathan, the accusation is that George W. Bush let people suffer and die because of their race.
I have no idea why he did it, but he did let people suffer and die.
And you have a senator saying stuff like that. I think it's irresponsible.
That has nothing to do with Ferguson, though. But I mean, that's fine.
It has everything to do with Ferguson. With the mentality of Ferguson, the reaction a lot of people had in the community has to do with a victocrat mentality that I believe has been stoked by people like Claire McCaskill and like Eric Holder, Jesse Jackson, and Al Sharpton.
Can we focus for a brief second on the mentality? I like that, the mentality. So you tend to have, like, let's say you have a group of, black people rioting in the United States, right? So you have, like, rioting over Ferguson, you had, like, rioting in, L.A. over Rodney King. So when white people riot, it tends to be over pumpkin festivals and surfing competitions and coaches being fired and college celebrations and Super Bowl wins. Why is that not a conversation about mentality? Why do we never go, geez, what is the mentality of a bunch of privileged people turning over cars over nothing? I mean, because it's like, if you're going to riot, if there must be riots, can it be over an injustice, a murder, a beating of someone where the police were allowed to get off? If you're gonna riot, I mean, why aren't you talking about the mentality and the mind of those people? Because we have far more of those riots than we've seen of these riots, and they're also a minority of the demonstrations that are taking place across the world. It is the minority of them that become violent and destroy property or lead to theft. Like, why is that? Why don't they ever touch on that? Maybe I'm missing something.
Well, I think you are missing something.
Tell me.
I think the problem is there's a disproportionate amount of crime in the black community.
Right.
That's why we're focusing on it. That's why.
Again, but you're not touching on the issue. So we're talking about, oh my God, these crazy riots and they turned over cars and stuff. But when that happened in Huntington Beach, because there was a surfing competition, nothing happened. It was just a surfing competition. Not once, but twice, in the 80s and I think a year ago. So why was there no broad conversation about what is going on in the white community to lead people to do these kinds of things?
In other words, you want crime to be covered as thoroughly in white communities as it's covered in black communities?
No,
because crime is not covered as much in white communities as you think it should be?
No.
There's a problem?
I'm talking about the hypocrisy in the conversation about Martin Luther King, very peaceful person generally, right? We would agree on that. He's pretty safe. America likes him, right? They'll teach you about him in school. Martin Luther King said that riots are the voice of people who are unheard. Martin Luther King was also rewarded by being shot for his peaceful protesting. So I think you're trying to direct this idea that there is one community that is somehow violent and somehow riots and does all these things when it's very American. I mean, you do recall that America burned down Georgia or Atlanta during the Civil War. They burned their own city in their own state because they couldn't figure out a better way.
You are describing a country that I don't know.
I'm describing American history.
You're describing a country where nothing has improved in the last decade.
Tell me what I said.
A country that does not have a black president. A country that has not reelected a black president. A country that doesn't have a black AG. A country that doesn't have a black CEO of McDonald's. For crying out loud. This is not your grandfather's America.
We've got a country with a black president where at rallies there are so many racist signs I can't even keep track of them, that has experienced record opposition from a party who...
TJ, I need a final thought from you real quickly.
What I said that wasn't true. What did I say that wasn't true? Tell me.
I'm going to help you. You said that George Bush essentially killed blacks.
No, I didn't.
In Katrina.
Yeah, you did.
You
No, I didn't.
absolutely
I said he
did.
allowed that situation to occur, and he did.
Whites died, Hispanics died, probably Native Americans, Asians, and so forth.
What was the community
attributed-
predominantly? Was it a predominantly black community?
So we discard the other people?
That's not what I asked you. I'm asking you if it was a predominantly black community.
It was predominantly black.
And when those black
I guess
people
you
look
guys,
around,
I guess you guys are not going to
assumption.
resolve it. Charles, real quickly, a final statement.
You know, I would just love to see when we don't have to rise, when we can turn some of that anger into actions and everyone as an individual do their part to create that action.
we can not surf or have pumpkin festivals, and then there will be no more riots.
I think we're
Or
on the
direct
same side of the line. We
characterizations.
want people to be able to realize their potential. Right. I want to thank our viewers for watching. We're back at you again on Monday, 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock p.m. It's been a pleasure sitting in for Rick Amato. I'm Larry Elder, and I leave you now with my Amato Meal moment of the day, part 2 of the Democratic Sizzle Reel.
People are not educated how to use the internet.
Call it the stupidity of the American voter or whatever.
I don't know who he is. He didn't help write our bill. And so I don't know if you have seen Jonathan Gruber of MIT's analysis.
We came out of the White House not only dead broke, but in debt.
Don't let anybody tell you that it's corporations and businesses that create jobs.
If a JV team puts on Lakers uniforms, that doesn't make them Kobe Bryant.
I wasn't specifically referring to ISIL. We don't have a strategy yet.
On the story of Benghazi, as you look back at your involvement in all of that, do you have any regrets?
David, no.
Dude, this was like 2 years ago. We're still talking about the most mundane process.